A hooded figure moved through the forest, each step a thunderous beat from a martial arts tale. The young man realized he had to watch and copy the hooded figure to learn. He walked with purpose, clenching his hands into tight fists. The young man watched the hooded figure walk on through the forest. The hooded figure glanced back with a knowing smile. Then he turned and led the young man deeper into the forest. The old man started teaching him all about the mountain. The old man had him touch the trees, explaining that every mountain had its own species. He had him repeatedly trace the land with his hands to learn its terrain. He then used a stick to trace a lesson for him in the dirt. As the young man rested after his training, a hooded figure quietly observed him. With a quiet rustle, the hooded figure reached for the pouch at his waist. He then slipped a small dark object into a hidden fold of his clothes. The hooded figure pointed downwards, exclaiming he had finally found it. Juwan was excited to finally eat the lunchbox Lizzy had made for him. With a final click, Juwan connected the two pieces of the object. Juwan opened the food box, exclaiming that it smelled delicious. Suddenly, a voice shouted at him not to open his lunchbox there. He looked up to see a hooded man pointing down at him. He cried out, startled by the sudden confrontation. He realized the smell of his prepared food stood out too much. Its strong scent would spread through the forest, instantly alerting the animals. He held the meal Lizzy worked so hard on, fearing this would be their last. He felt like he was going to cry. Standing before the wooden house, he remarked that this was where she lived. Then, he noticed a cloaked old man holding a bow with a peculiar shape. He commented that the only bows he knew were curved like a D or a C. He wondered how anyone was supposed to shoot with a bow like that. The hooded figure told the young man to take the bow and follow him. The hooded figure walked away, leaving the young man to wonder if this was even possible. The young man thought it would take incredible strength to pull a bow that enormous. The hooded figure drew back the enormous bowstring with surprising ease. The hooded figure was so steady that it seemed like time itself had stopped. The arrow shot forward with impossible speed. With a deafening crack, the arrow buried itself in a massive tree. An onlooker exclaimed in wonder at the hooded figure's archery. Juwan then took the bow himself, aiming carefully as the hooded man observed. The hooded man adjusted his arm, helping Juwan draw the bowstring taut. Juwan wondered why his target wasn't moving at all. Juwan reminded himself to focus as he steadied his aim. He absorbed the words and movements of a true hunter. He resolved to practice hard so he could soon handle things on his own. He wanted to become a man who could provide for his wife and daughter. Then he sang a simple song about the sky and Lizzy's bright hair. The day ended at their quiet home deep within the forest. A young blonde girl kicked her legs happily, thinking of Juwan's black hair and nice, red meat. Lizzy lay back feeling so full, thinking the meat was still growing inside her. A sinister laugh echoed as Dorothy watched Lizzy kneel on the floor in distress. Dorothy thought about how Lizzy laughed so much now, recalling a time when neither of them ever did. Hearing her laugh made Juwan feel warm, like sitting by a stove. Lizzy rubbed her full stomach and hoped she could eat again soon. Dorothy then wondered who Juwan was, if Lizzy was his wife and also Daddy's wife. Juwan carried the sleeping child through the quiet starry night. She then realized Juwan and Lizzy weren't her real parents and questioned what he was to her. Hand in hand, Juwan and Lizzy walked into the light. She feared they would also leave her, just like her father had. She worried that as Lizzy's husband, Juwan would only take Lizzy. The young blonde girl clenched her fists, her eyes filling with tears. But the pressing question was what would happen to Dorothy. Suddenly Lizzy cried out in startled pain. Then the small blonde girl looked around the room, asking where the other woman had gone. Then a cruel voice called her a useless girl. She stared upward, a terrified sound caught in her throat. He told her that unlike a boy who could work, she was a useless thing who wasted food. Shock and distress twisted her expression. Then the small blonde girl scrambled for the bucket, shouting that the meat had to come first. The small blonde girl confirmed the meat was safe, then wondered where she had gone. Suddenly, an angry voice demanded to know what the small blonde girl was hiding. The small blonde girl cried out, flinching back in terror. Carefully, the small blonde girl pushed open a creaking wooden window. She realized she had seen these people before. She said men used to beat her father, who would then beat her and her stepmother terribly. She worried the girl would be beaten to death just like her mother. The man grabbed the distressed woman's arm, accusing her of stealing their meat. He scoffed at her insistence that her husband hunted the meat, calling it complete nonsense. Juwan demanded to know why she was stealing from them after they had found her a husband to survive. The accuser declared they would go inside to check what else she had stolen. Suddenly, an angry shout demanded his silence. One of the men sent Lizzy sprawling to the ground with a scream. Elsewhere, 3 men entered a room and found a small creature waiting on a table. One of the men wondered aloud if the object was a wolf pelt. The blond man touched the dark-haired figure, declaring they had hit the jackpot. Suddenly, a voice shouted for them to search every corner. Then the armed men and their wolf rushed through the building. Lying on the floor, a blonde-haired girl asked if there was meat too. The blonde-haired girl was struck by the terrifying thought that they had actually hunted. Suddenly, a brown-haired woman sprinted forward with determination. She lunged forward, screaming not to touch that. The brown-haired woman shouted that it was theirs now. 3 men loomed over a woman with long hair, and the blonde-haired man taunted her about how powerless she had once been. A blonde-haired man lashed out at a brown-haired woman's neck, sneering that marriage had made her bold. A blonde-haired character slammed face-first onto the floor, the impact echoing through the tense silence. A brown-haired woman clenched her fist and let out a strained sound, struggling to steady herself as a blonde child stared at her in shock. A young woman with long brown hair stared ahead, silent and tense, as sweat began to bead on her brow. A young woman with long brown hair gasped in shock, unable to hide her fear. A blonde-haired girl stared ahead, her wide eyes glowing with shock. Someone finally admitted they had been pretending not to know the truth all along. A tearful young blonde girl crawled across the floor, trembling as she wondered aloud if she was hated for always hiding and being a bad child. A blonde man sneered down at the brown-haired woman, mocking her by asking if she thought life was worth living now with a different husband. Someone anxiously wondered what would happen if the mountain guardian discovered their actions. Someone with a cautious voice quietly insisted they had nothing to worry about, since the outsider couldn't understand their language as long as they stayed silent. One of the shadowy figures muttered that getting caught would be trouble, and losing the mountain guardian would make things even harder for them. A confident blonde man helped a distressed young woman to her feet, saying they could simply head to the forest. The blonde man seized the distressed woman's wrist and ordered the others to grab their things, grunting as he pulled her away. The blonde-haired man tightened his grip on the woman with long brown hair's wrist and threatened to burn down her cabin if she spoke to her husband. The assertive blonde man led the long-haired woman away, remarking that he hoped nothing unexpected would happen as several onlookers watched them leave. One of the men declared he had come here on a whim and ended up hitting the jackpot. A young man with dark hair pressed his hands to the floor, steadying himself as tension hung heavy in the air. Lizzy sat alone, facing the wall, after someone revealed she was dragged away and feared something terrible would happen to her. A frightened young girl rushed forward, silently fearing that Lizzy might never return. A young blonde girl in a pink dress covered her mouth, eyes wide with shock as she stared toward the glowing light. Lizzy burst into loud, desperate sobs, unable to hold back her fear. Lizzy cried out for Juwan, her voice echoing through the dim alley as she desperately searched for him. Someone shouted for help, their voice echoing urgently through the empty dark corridor. Someone shouted that Lizzy was being taken away as 3 adults and the young girl walked through the sunlit doorway toward the forest. A young man with dark hair trudged wearily through the dense forest, hands bound overhead, and muttered that today seemed never-ending. A pair of feet paused in the grass, the tension lingering in the hush that followed. A cloaked older man quietly tapped the shoulder of a young man with dark hair, making him gasp out in surprise. A young man bowed deeply to the hooded figure and quietly expressed his gratitude for everything that had happened today. A dark-haired young man jerked back in shock, calling out in alarm and realizing with disbelief that someone named Dorothy might be in trouble. A dark-haired boy stood in the silent forest, watching the distant cabin with unwavering focus. A young man with dark hair looked up at the night sky, worriedly wondering if something bad had happened to Dorothy at home. Soft footsteps pressed into the grass as a mysterious presence moved quietly through the calm night. A young man with dark hair ran urgently through the woods, thinking he would never forgive himself if Lizzy or Dorothy got hurt. 3 men moved swiftly through the forest, one blonde man carrying an unconscious woman, while the red-haired man followed close behind with a wooden barrel. A young man with dark hair clenched his fist and shouted that he would kill whoever was responsible. A red-haired man holding an unconscious dark-haired man let out a surprised gasp as an unknown attacker struck him hard across the head. A blonde-haired man and a dark-haired man hurled the red-haired man to the ground, leaving him grimacing in pain. A light-haired girl called out anxiously to Juwan. A dark-haired man with a clenched fist strode toward 3 fearful onlookers, one clutching an axe as tension charged the air. Suddenly, a long-haired figure seized a young man with dark hair by the neck, locking him in a tight chokehold. Juwan, a dark-haired young man, slammed his fist into the man in the blue shirt's face. Blood splattered as the man in blue staggered back, groaning in pain while 2 bystanders looked on in shock. A blonde man lunged forward and punched the dark-haired man with full force, their clash crackling with barely contained fury. Still, a dark-haired man rushed forward and tackled the blonde-haired man with raw force. Then, the dark-haired man flipped the blonde man hard onto the ground as he let out a stunned gasp. The dark-haired man pinned the blonde-haired man to the ground and raised his fist, telling himself he couldn't stop now. A dark-haired man slammed his fist into the blonde man's face, while a cold voice insisted that people will never respect you once they've decided you're beneath them. In his mind, a determined and focused thinker told himself he needed to engrave this moment into everyone's memory. Still, the dark-haired man clenched his fist and swore to make sure those enemies never returned. A dark-haired man sprang at the blonde man gripping his sword, while a shocked woman gasped, unable to process what was happening. Someone urgently called Juwan's name as he turned back, his fists glowing with blue energy. A blonde man swung his sickle at Juwan as someone shouted a desperate warning for him to watch out. Then one hand gripped another in a fierce struggle, each trying to overpower the other as tension crackled between them. A dark-haired man tightly gripped his sword, while a blonde man behind him shouted in alarm. A dark-haired boy screamed in agony, the pain crackling through his clenched teeth as a blue aura flickered around the mark on his face. Someone shouted Juwan's name with urgent force, their voice cutting through the chaos. A blonde man wrestled the dark-haired man back, just as a hooded man ordered everyone to stop immediately. The hooded man grabbed the dark-haired young man's arm and firmly told him to calm down as the blonde young man clutched his chest in pain. Still, a hooded elder pointed at the distant cabin and urgently told them to notice how frightened their daughter was. A worried young woman with long brown hair pauses in the forest, silently bracing herself as anxious thoughts flicker across her face. An upset and tearful child gripped the railing and cried out for help. A worried young man with dark hair glances back nervously at a brown-haired woman as tension lingers in the misty forest. A thin column of smoke drifted from the rooftop chimney, curling upward into the quiet morning air above the green field. A worried girl stood in the forest, quietly thinking that the gentle person beside her didn't seem capable of anger. The narrator reflects that she hadn't realized a man could become so furious, and for a moment, his rage reminded her of her late husband. A fearful man with dark hair stared at the bodies on the grass, wondering if he too would be beaten and feeling a surge of dread. A young man with dark hair looked into Juwan's eyes, quietly admitting his fear vanished when he realized those eyes weren't meant to frighten him. A young man with dark hair snapped to attention, shock flickering in his wide, focused eyes. He realized those eyes were desperately trying to protect him. Now the narrator draws sharp attention to Juwan's eyes, signaling a pivotal shift in the moment. A young man with dark hair glanced nervously at a woman with long hair as she insisted she wasn't afraid of him. A young woman with brown hair heard the black-haired man call out her name, Lizzy. Still, the brown-haired woman wondered why her reaction could worry and frighten him so deeply. Still, a young woman clutched her chest, anxiety tightening her expression. Still, the brown-haired woman gripped her laces and wondered why she trembled, realizing he must think she was frightened of him. Still, the dark-haired man lowered his gaze as a woman's voice pleaded with her husband not to look so hurt. A nervous dark-haired man hesitated, wishing he could say he wasn't afraid, but knew their words would never reach each other. Still, the brown-shirted person clutched their chest and stretched out a trembling arm, caught in a wave of physical distress. A young woman with brown hair called out desperately for Juwan. Still, a dark-haired man and a woman in a skirt walked toward each other on the quiet forest path. A dark-haired man stood quietly in the forest, gently holding hands with a long-haired woman as they gazed into each other's eyes. A young woman with brown hair gently held the injured hand of a dark-haired man, realizing with certainty what she felt the moment they touched. A young woman with long brown hair smiled softly, feeling certain she would be safe as long as she stayed by this person's side. A light-haired woman gently took the darker-skinned man's wrist in her hands, her soft smile carrying a sense of reassurance. A tearful young woman squeezed the unseen person's hand and quietly expressed her gratitude.